I never believed in miracles until I heard one ticking inside a dying man's chest. The night I first entered Ravensholm Manor, I came to fix a machine, but I left with something far more dangerous lodged beneath my own ribs, something no engineer could ever repair. My name is Eleanor Ashford, and I was not born for greatness. I was born for survival. My father had been a clockmaker of some reputation in Cheapside, a man whose hands could coax music from the smallest gears, whose eyes could find the fault in any mechanism. He taught me everything he knew, not because he believed a woman should work with tools and oil, but because I was all he had, and I loved it. I loved the way a broken watch would surrender its secrets to patience. I loved the moment when silence became ticking, when stillness became motion. My father used to say that every machine has a soul, and if you listen closely enough, it will tell you what it needs. He died when I was 19, leaving behind a shop drowned in debt and a mother whose health had already begun its long, slow fade. I sold what I could. I begged where I had to. And when Mr. Cornelius Finch, the owner of a modest scientific instruments workshop in Holborn, offered me a position as a technical assistant, I accepted without hesitation. It was irregular. It was whispered about. A woman working with brass and copper and steam. But Mr. Finch was old and half blind, and he needed hands that could do what his could not. He did not care that those hands belonged to a woman so long as the work was done and done well. For 3 years, I lived in the shadows of that workshop. I repaired barometers and telescopes. I calibrated pressure gauges for factories I would never see. I learned to speak the language of pistons and valves, of electrical currents and pneumatic systems. And I learned, too, to make myself small, to be invisible, to never draw attention. Because attention, for a woman in my position, meant trouble. I did not know on that October evening when the letter arrived that my life of invisibility was about to end. The envelope was heavy, cream-colored, sealed with black wax, bearing an unfamiliar crest. Mr. Finch handed it to me with trembling fingers and an expression I could not read. When I opened it, I found a summons. Not a request, a summons. The Duke of Ravensholm required my presence at his estate. I was to come alone. I was to tell no one. A carriage would arrive for me at dawn. There was no explanation. No mention of what service I might provide. Only a single line at the bottom, written in a hand that slanted sharply to the left, as if the writer had been in great haste or great pain. They say you can hear what others cannot. I need someone who listens. I did not sleep that night. I sat by the window of the small room I shared with my mother, watching the fog curl through the streets below, and I wondered what kind of man sends for a woman he has never met, in secrecy, in darkness, with words that sounded almost like a prayer. The carriage arrived before the sun rose. It was black and unmarked, drawn by 2 horses whose coats gleamed like wet coal. The driver did not speak to me. He simply opened the door and waited, and I climbed inside with my tool bag clutched against my chest like a shield. We drove for hours. The city fell away behind us, its familiar stench of coal smoke and sewage giving way to the cleaner air of the countryside. I watched through the carriage window as fields rolled past, golden with late harvest, dotted with farmhouses that trailed thin ribbons of chimney smoke into the gray October sky. The trees grew thicker as we traveled, oaks and elms and ancient chestnuts that lined the road like silent sentinels, their leaves just beginning to turn from green to gold and russet. I had never been so far from London. My entire life had been contained within a few square miles of the city, bounded by the workshop and the market and the cramped rooms where my mother lay coughing into her handkerchief. The vastness of the countryside unsettled me. There was too much space, too much silence, too much sky pressing down on the land. We stopped once, at a coaching inn where the driver watered the horses and I was offered tea and bread by a serving girl who looked at my practical traveling clothes with undisguised curiosity. I ate quickly, too anxious to taste the food, and climbed back into the carriage before the horses had finished drinking. It was late afternoon when we turned off the main road onto a long gravel drive that wound through ancient oaks. The trees here were enormous, their branches twisted into strange shapes by centuries of wind and weather, their roots bulging up through the ground like the knuckles of buried giants. Spanish moss hung from their limbs, gray and ghostly, swaying in a breeze I could not feel inside the carriage. And then, as the sun began to sink toward the horizon and the shadows lengthened into fingers of darkness, Ravensholm Manor appeared through the mist. I felt my breath catch in my throat. It was enormous, a sprawling mass of gray stone and Gothic towers that seemed to grow out of the earth itself. Gargoyles crouched along the roofline, their faces worn smooth by time, but still recognizable as demons and dragons and other creatures of nightmare. Ivy crawled up the walls, thick and dark, covering entire wings of the building in a shroud of green. The windows were dark, every one of them, as if the house had been abandoned to the elements and the slow decay of neglect. But it was not abandoned. I could see smoke rising from one of the chimneys, a thin gray plume that spoke of life within those cold stone walls. And more than that, I could hear something, a sound that seemed to come from the very foundations of the manor, a rhythmic thumping that echoed through the ground and the air and the deepest chambers of my heart. It was like a heartbeat, a giant heart beating in the earth beneath my feet. The gardens that surrounded the manor were overgrown, hedges that had once been carefully trimmed, now sprawling wild and untamed. Flower beds choked with weeds, a fountain in the center of the drive, cracked and dry and filled with dead leaves. There was a sadness to the place, a sense of beauty abandoned and grandeur forgotten, that made my chest ache with an emotion I could not name. I had expected wealth. I had expected privilege. I had not expected this terrible, haunting loneliness. The driver left me at the front door without a word. I stood there for a long moment, my hand raised to knock, my courage faltering. The door was massive, carved from some dark wood I did not recognize, studded with iron nails, and bearing a knocker in the shape of a raven with wings spread wide. The bird's eyes seemed to follow me as I stood there, judging me, finding me wanting. I could still leave. I could turn around, walk back down the drive, find my way to the main road, and beg a ride from some passing farmer. I could return to my life in London, to the workshop and the sickbed, and the slow grinding poverty that was all I had ever known. But even as I thought it, I knew I would not do it. Whatever waited for me behind that door, I had to know. I had to understand why a duke would send for a woman like me, why he would speak of listening in a letter sealed with black wax. I raised my hand to knock, but before my knuckles could touch the wood, the door swung open on silent hinges, revealing a corridor lit by gas lamps that flickered and hissed like living things. The light they cast was blue and unsteady, dancing across walls lined with portraits in gilded frames and casting long shadows that moved and shifted as I watched. And there, waiting in those shadows, was a figure. He was tall. That was the first thing I noticed. Tall and thin, with shoulders that seemed to carry some invisible weight, as if the very air around him was heavier than it should be. He wore a dark coat, cut in the fashion of a gentleman, but showing signs of wear at the cuffs and collar. His hair was dark, nearly black, but streaked with gray at the temples in a way that spoke not of age, but of worry, of sleepless nights and burdens too heavy to bear. He could not have been much older than 30, but there was something ancient in the way he held himself, something weary and worn. His face was angular, almost severe, with cheekbones that caught the flickering light like blades of polished bone. His jaw was strong, shadowed with stubble that suggested he had not shaved in days. His lips were thin, pressed together in a line that might have been disapproval or pain or something else entirely. But it was his eyes that held me. They were the color of winter storms, pale and gray and endless, like the sky before snow falls. And in their depths I saw something that made my breath catch in my throat. Not coldness, not arrogance, but pain. A vast, oceanic pain that seemed to have no bottom and no shore. This was a man who was suffering, a man who had been suffering for a very long time. "You came," he said, and his voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together beneath deep water. It seemed to cost him something to speak, as if even those two small words required more strength than he had to spare. "I am Eleanor Ashford," I replied, and I was proud that my voice did not shake, proud that I met those storm-gray eyes without flinching. "You sent for me." He studied me for a long moment, his gaze moving slowly over my face, my plain wool coat with its carefully mended seams, my work-roughened hands that I had scrubbed raw before leaving but could never quite make clean. I saw something flicker in his expression, surprise perhaps, or disappointment, or maybe just the weariness of a man who had stopped expecting anything good from the world. I wondered what he had expected. A man, probably. Someone older, more established, more worthy of his attention. Not a girl barely past 20 with ink stains on her fingers and the smell of machine oil in her hair. And then he turned and began to walk down the corridor, his footsteps echoing against the marble floor. "Follow me," he said. "I will show you why you are here." I followed. What else could I do? The corridor twisted and turned, leading deeper into the house, past rooms shrouded in dust cloths like ghosts of furniture, past portraits whose eyes seemed to track our movement with silent accusation. I glimpsed ballrooms with chandeliers wrapped in white muslin, their crystals dull and lightless. I glimpsed parlors where the drapes had been drawn so long that they had faded to the color of old bone. I glimpsed a music room where a grand piano sat alone beneath a sheet, its keys covered, its voice silenced. This house had once been alive, I realized. It had once been filled with light and music and laughter. But something had happened to it. Something had drained the life from its walls, leaving only this echoing emptiness behind. The thumping sound grew louder with every step, and I realized it was not my imagination. Something was alive in this house, something mechanical and vast, and it was breathing. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, thrumming through the floorboards and the walls and the very air I breathed. We descended a staircase, the steps worn smooth by generations of feet, the banister cold iron beneath my palm. The gaslight grew dimmer here, the shadows deeper, and the air took on a different quality. It smelled of copper and ozone, of machine oil and something else, something sharp and medicinal that made my nose tingle. We were going underground, into the cellars, into the place where the heartbeat lived. When we reached the bottom of the stairs, Sebastian produced a key from his coat pocket and unlocked a heavy door reinforced with iron bands. The door swung open, and I stepped through into what must have been the cellars, though cellar seemed too ordinary a word for what I found there. It was a laboratory, a vast cathedral of science carved from the living rock beneath the manor. The ceiling arched high overhead, supported by columns of brick and stone, and the walls stretched away into shadows that the gaslight could not reach. Workbenches lined every surface, cluttered with tools and components and half-finished machines that bristled with gears and wires. Diagrams papered the walls, overlapping and crowding each other, sketches of hearts and lungs and things I did not recognize, mathematical equations and chemical formulas and notes in a handwriting that slanted sharply to the left. Shelves held jars of specimens floating in amber fluid. Glass cases displayed anatomical models of the human body, their painted surfaces showing the pathways of veins and arteries in vivid red and blue. Electrical equipment hummed in the corners, their coils crackling with blue sparks, their needles twitching on dials I could not read. And in the center of it all, bathed in the blue-white glow of electrical arcs that leaped between copper terminals, stood the machine. I had never seen anything like it. Nothing in my experience, nothing in my father's workshop or Mr. Finch's establishment or all the illustrated journals I had ever read had prepared me for this. It was the size of a small carriage, perhaps larger, a magnificent and terrifying tangle of copper pipes and glass chambers and spinning gears. Steam hissed from joints sealed with rubber gaskets, rising in white plumes that caught the blue light and glowed like phantom breath. Electricity crackled along wires thick as my finger, jumping between nodes with sounds like tiny thunderclaps. Pressure gauges clustered like eyes along its surface, their needles quivering, their faces glowing with luminescent paint. At its heart, suspended in a cylinder of clear fluid that caught the light and scattered it into rainbows, was something that looked almost like a human heart, but it was not human. It was made of metal and rubber and God knew what else, chambers of brass connected by tubes of flexible material, valves that opened and closed with mechanical precision. And it was beating. I could see it. I could hear it. The source of that great rhythmic sound that had followed me through the house, that seemed to pulse in my very bones. Thump, thump, thump. The artificial heart, the mechanical miracle that was keeping a dying man alive. The Duke stood beside it, his hand resting on one of the pipes, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I call it the cardiomechanical sustainer," he said. "It is designed to keep a human heart beating when the organ itself begins to fail." I stared at him, then at the machine, then back at him. The implications of what he was telling me slowly unfurled in my mind like a dark flower blooming. This was not merely an invention. This was not just a scientific curiosity. This was a lifeline, a thread stretched thin between a dying man and the void. "You mean it replaces the heart?" I asked, though even as I said the words, I knew they were not quite right. "No." He shook his head, and I saw a flash of something in his eyes, frustration perhaps, or the weariness of a man who had explained this too many times to too many people who did not understand. "It supports it, augments it. The heart remains, my heart remains, but the machine takes over the functions it can no longer perform. Pumping blood when the chambers are too weak to contract properly, maintaining rhythm when the natural pacemaker fails, keeping pressure stable when the vessels begin to leak." He paused, and something dark passed across his face. A shadow of memory, a ghost of pain. At least, that is what it is supposed to do. I stepped closer, drawn by the hum and click of the mechanism despite myself. My father had taught me that every machine has a voice, and if you listen carefully enough, you can hear what it is trying to tell you. The voice of this machine was complex, layered, a symphony of sounds that spoke of incredible complexity and incredible desperation. The artificial heart in its chamber was not beating smoothly. I could hear it now that I was closer, now that I let myself truly listen. There was a stutter in the rhythm, a hesitation, a tiny moment of uncertainty in each cycle where the beat seemed to falter before catching itself and continuing. It was like a singer who keeps forgetting the words, who has to pause and remember before going on. And then I understood. The realization hit me like a physical blow, making me take a step backward, making my hand rise unbidden to my own chest where my own heart beat steady and strong. "You have used it on yourself," I said. It was not a question. I did not need to ask. The truth was written in every line of his body, in the pallor of his skin, in the blue shadows beneath his eyes, in the faint blue tinge to his lips that spoke of blood not receiving enough oxygen. The Duke did not answer, but he did not need to. I saw the truth in the way he stood, one hand pressed against his chest in a gesture that seemed almost unconscious, protective, as if he could shield his failing heart from my gaze. I saw it in the hollows of his cheeks, in the slight tremor of his fingers, in the careful, measured way he breathed. He was dying. The machine was keeping him alive, buying him hours and days and weeks that his body could not provide on its own. But it was failing, and he was dying, and we were standing in the basement of a crumbling manor surrounded by the only hope he had left. "The doctors told me I had 2 years, he said finally, and his voice was quiet now, stripped of pretense, naked with a vulnerability I had not expected from a Duke. That was 3 years ago. This machine has given me time I should not have had. Time to complete my research. Time to try to perfect the design. Time to find someone who could fix what I could not. But something is wrong. The rhythm destabilizes without warning. The pressure fluctuates outside safe parameters. The synchronization between the machine and my heart keeps breaking down, and each time it takes longer to restore." He turned to look at me, and in his eyes I saw not pride or anger or the cold arrogance I might have expected, but something raw and desperate and terribly human. "I have consulted every engineer and physician in England. I have brought in specialists from France, from Germany, from the Americas, and none of them can find the fault. None of them can hear what is wrong. And then I heard about you. I did not know what to say. I was a workshop assistant, a nobody from Cheapside, with oil under her fingernails and no formal training. What could I possibly offer that the finest minds in England could not? They say you have a gift," he continued. "They say you can hear what others cannot, that you can feel the fault in a mechanism the way a physician feels for a pulse." He stepped closer, and I caught the scent of metal and ozone and something else, something warm and human beneath it all. I am not a man who believes in gifts, Miss Ashford. I believe in science, in logic, in the observable and the measurable. But I have run out of logical options. So I am asking you, as one last desperate act, to listen to my machine and tell me why it is killing me. I should have refused. I should have told him that I was not qualified, that this was beyond my abilities, that he needed someone better. But I looked at that machine, and I heard the stutter in its rhythm, and I felt something stir in my chest, curiosity perhaps, or pity, or something else entirely, something that had no name and no logic. I will try, I said. He let out a breath I do not think he knew he was holding. Then let us begin. That first night, I did not touch the machine. I only listened. I walked around it slowly, my eyes closed, my hands clasped behind my back, and I let the sound of it fill my head. The Duke watched me in silence, and I was acutely aware of his gaze, of the weight of his attention, of the way my skin prickled whenever he drew near. The machine spoke to me in a language of clicks and hisses, of pressure releases and electrical hums. I heard the steam flowing through its pipes, the gears turning in their housings, the artificial heart pumping its synthetic blood. And beneath it all, I heard something else, a hesitation, a moment of doubt in each cycle, as if the machine itself were uncertain whether to continue. There is a conflict, I said finally, opening my eyes. Two rhythms fighting for dominance. The Duke frowned. Two rhythms? I nodded, trying to find words for what I had heard. The machine has its own pulse, the rate at which it was designed to operate, but there is another pulse interfering with it. Something irregular, something that changes. He was silent for a long moment, and then he laughed, a bitter sound without humor. My heart, he said, the one I was born with. It still beats, you see, even as it fails. The machine is meant to take over, to impose its own rhythm, but my heart will not surrender. It keeps fighting, keeps trying to beat on its own, and the conflict is tearing both of them apart. I stared at him, this man who had built a machine to save his own life and was being destroyed by the very organ he was trying to save. There was something almost poetic in it, almost tragic, and I felt, in that moment, a sudden fierce desire to help him. Not because he was a duke, not because he was wealthy, not because I feared what might happen if I failed, but because I understood what it meant to fight a battle you could not win, to keep trying even when every rational part of you knew it was hopeless. Then we need to find a way to make them work together, I said. Not fighting, cooperating. He looked at me as if I had said something extraordinary. That is precisely what I have been trying to do for 2 years, Miss Ashford, and I have failed. Perhaps you have been thinking about it wrong, I said. And the words came out before I could stop them, bold and presumptuous in a way I never allowed myself to be. Perhaps you have been trying to make your heart obey the machine. But what if the machine learned to follow your heart instead? Something changed in his face then. I could not say what it was, only that the despair I had seen there seemed to recede, replaced by something sharper and brighter. Curiosity, perhaps, or the first faint spark of hope. Stay, he said. Stay as long as you need. I will provide whatever resources you require, and if you succeed, if you find a way to make this work, I will see to it that you never want for anything again. I should have negotiated. I should have demanded terms, asked about compensation, established boundaries. But I was too tired and too intrigued and too foolish to do any of those things. I simply nodded and said, "Show me everything." The days that followed blurred into one another, marked not by sunrises and sunsets, but by discoveries and setbacks, by long hours spent in that underground laboratory surrounded by machines and the man who had built them. I learned the rhythms of Ravensholm Manor, the way the morning light filtered through the dusty windows of the upper floors, catching motes of dust that swirled like tiny dancers, the way the wind sighed through the gaps in the old stone walls, a mournful sound that seemed to carry the weight of centuries, the way the house creaked and settled at night, its ancient bones protesting the cold. I learned, too, the rhythms of Sebastian Vane. He rose before dawn every day, driven from sleep by dreams he would not discuss, but that left shadows under his eyes and tension in his jaw. He worked through the morning hours with a fierce, almost desperate intensity, checking readings and adjusting calibrations and filling journals with notes in his slanting handwriting. He ate little, and only when reminded, and he drank too much coffee, black and bitter, which I learned to brew just the way he liked it. In the afternoons, when his body demanded rest, even if his mind did not, he would retreat to the library. It was a vast room on the second floor, lined with shelves that rose from floor to ceiling, filled with books in a dozen languages on subjects ranging from ancient philosophy to modern physics. There was a fireplace where a fire always burned, tended by an elderly manservant named Hughes, who seemed to be the only member of the household staff that Sebastian actually trusted. There were comfortable chairs arranged before the hearth, and a chessboard set up on a table between them. Though I never saw Sebastian play, he would sit in one of those chairs, a book open in his lap, but I do not think he read. I would catch him staring into the flames, his eyes unfocused, his thoughts clearly far away. I wondered what he saw there, what memories haunted him, what regrets. The Duke, I learned, was named Sebastian Vane. He was the 7th Duke of Ravensholm, the last of a once great family, now reduced to a single dying heir. His father had been a noted industrialist, a man who had made a fortune in railways and used that fortune to purchase a title and a crumbling manor and the illusion of aristocratic respectability. His mother had been a society beauty, the daughter of an impoverished earl who had traded her youth and her beauty for financial security. She had died giving birth to Sebastian's younger brother, Thomas, leaving behind 2 sons and a husband who blamed them both for her death. Sebastian spoke of his father rarely, and always with a careful neutrality that told me more than any outburst could have. Lord Vane had been a cold man, ambitious and calculating, who had seen his sons not as children to be loved, but as instruments of his legacy. Sebastian, the elder, was to inherit the title and the fortune, and carry on the family name. Thomas, the younger, was the spare, kept in reserve in case something happened to his brother. But it was Thomas who had been the golden child, Thomas who had inherited their mother's beauty and their father's charm, Thomas who had moved through the world with an ease that Sebastian, awkward and bookish and forever lost in his own thoughts, could never match. Everyone had loved Thomas. Even Sebastian, though his love was complicated by envy and guilt and the terrible knowledge that he could never be what his brother was. And then Thomas had died, and Sebastian had been left alone with a father who could not forgive him for surviving, and a title he had never wanted, and a heart that had begun to fail, as if in punishment for sins he could not name. He lived alone in this crumbling estate, with only a handful of servants, most of whom had been with the family for generations, and stayed more out of loyalty to the memory of the old Lord Vane than out of any attachment to his son. They feared Sebastian, I realized, not because he was cruel or unkind, but because he was strange, because he spent his days underground, surrounded by machines that hummed and crackled with unnatural energy, because he had done something to himself, something they did not understand and could not explain, something that kept him alive when he should have been dead. Only Hughes, the elderly manservant, seemed to truly care for him, and even Hughes kept his distance, maintaining the formal boundaries of master and servant, even when Sebastian clearly craved something more. He was brilliant. I realized this within hours of beginning my work. His understanding of mechanical and electrical systems surpassed anything I had encountered, and his diagrams revealed a mind that saw connections where others saw only chaos. He could look at a problem and immediately perceive its essential nature, stripping away the irrelevant details to find the core truth hidden beneath. But he was also stubborn and proud and utterly convinced that he was right, even when the evidence suggested otherwise. He had spent so long alone, so long working without collaboration or feedback, that he had developed blind spots he could not see. He would pursue a line of reasoning long past the point where it had become clear it was leading nowhere, simply because he could not admit that he had made a mistake. We argued constantly about calibrations and tolerances, about materials and methods, about the fundamental nature of what we were trying to achieve. He wanted precision. I wanted flexibility. He wanted to control every variable, to eliminate every source of uncertainty, to reduce the problem to pure mathematics. I wanted to leave room for the unexpected, to build in redundancies and fail-safes, to accept that some things could not be predicted or controlled. He would grow frustrated with me, his voice rising, his hands gesturing sharply as he tried to make me understand. And I would stand my ground, refusing to back down, refusing to be intimidated by his title or his genius or the intensity of his gray-eyed gaze. And then, suddenly, in the middle of an argument, he would stop. He would look at me as if seeing me for the first time, and he would laugh, a sound that seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised me. A genuine laugh that transformed his severe face into something almost handsome. "You are not afraid of me," he said once, and there was wonder in his voice. "Should I be? Everyone else is." He looked away, toward the machine that dominated the center of the laboratory. "They think I am mad. Perhaps they are right." "You are not mad," I said. "You are desperate. There is a difference." He was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was very quiet. "Yes, perhaps there is." And beneath all of it, beneath the technical disputes and the frustrated silences, beneath the arguments and the breakthroughs and the long hours of work, there was something else growing between us, something I tried very hard not to name. I noticed small things at first. The way he brought me tea without being asked, appearing at my elbow with a cup prepared exactly the way I liked it, with milk and no sugar, before I even realized I was thirsty. The way his voice softened when he spoke to me, losing some of its coldness, its bitter edge, becoming almost gentle. The way he watched me when he thought I was not looking, his gray eyes following my movements with an intensity that made my pulse quicken and my cheeks flush. I noticed the way he would stand closer to me than was strictly necessary, his shoulder almost brushing mine as we bent over a diagram together. The way his hand would linger when he passed me a tool, his fingers grazing mine for just a moment longer than they needed to. The way he said my name, Eleanor, with a reverence that made it sound like a prayer. I told myself it meant nothing. I told myself he was my employer, a duke, a man so far above my station that even thinking about him was foolish. I told myself that he was dying, that whatever connection I imagined between us was simply the desperation of a man grasping for any human warmth before the end. I told myself these things over and over again, as if repetition could make them true. But then I began to notice something else, something that defied everything I thought I knew about science and machines and the rational order of the universe. The first time it happened, I thought I was imagining things. I thought the exhaustion was playing tricks on my mind, making me see patterns that were not there, hear rhythms that existed only in my own desperate hope. I was adjusting one of the pressure regulators, a delicate operation that required steady hands and absolute focus. The brass valve was cool beneath my fingers, slightly slick with condensation from the steam that flowed through the pipe. I had done this same adjustment 100 times before in Mr. Finch's workshop on simpler machines, and my hands moved almost without conscious thought, following a rhythm learned through years of practice. And then I heard it. Or rather, I heard the absence of something I had grown so accustomed to that I barely noticed it anymore. The stutter was gone. The artificial heart, which had been beating with that maddening hesitation ever since my first night at Ravensholm, was suddenly pumping smoothly. The rhythm was even, steady, strong. Each beat followed the last with perfect precision, like the ticking of a masterfully crafted clock. I froze, my fingers still on the brass valve, hardly daring to breathe. The machine hummed beneath my hands, and the heart beat on, perfect and steady. 1 beat, 2 beats, 3, 4, each one exactly the same, exactly as it should be, with no faltering, no uncertainty, no fear. The gauges confirmed what my ears were telling me. The pressure readings that had fluctuated wildly for weeks were suddenly stable. The electrical current that had spiked and dropped without warning was flowing at a constant rate. Every dial, every meter, every indicator showed a system in perfect equilibrium. Sebastian had been working at one of the other benches, but the sudden silence in the room, the absence of the irregular rhythm that had become the background music of our days, made him look up. He crossed the laboratory in 3 long strides, his eyes fixed on the gauges, his face a mask of disbelief. "What did you do?" he asked, and his voice was barely above a whisper. I do not know, I admitted. I was just adjusting the pressure. It has never done that before. He stared at the readings, then at the machine, then at me. His gray eyes were wide, almost wild, with an emotion I could not name. The rhythm has never been this stable. Not once, in 3 years. Not even when I first installed the apparatus. I did not know what to say. I did not know what I had done. My hands had performed the same movements they always did, had applied the same principles and techniques I had used 1,000 times before. There was nothing different about this adjustment, nothing special, nothing that should have produced such a dramatic result. I pulled my hands away from the valve, stepping back from the machine, and we both watched, barely breathing, as the seconds stretched into minutes. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3. The heart beat on, strong and steady, and for a moment I dared to hope that we had found it, that we had accidentally stumbled upon the solution we had been searching for. But then, so gradually that I almost missed it, the rhythm began to change. The beats that had been so perfectly even started to stretch, just slightly, just a tiny fraction of a second longer between each pulse. And then came the hesitation, that familiar faltering, that moment of uncertainty, as if the machine had forgotten how to beat and had to remember all over again. The stutter returned. The pressure readings began to fluctuate. The electrical current spiked and dropped. Within 5 minutes, the machine was exactly as it had been before, struggling and uncertain and clearly, terribly wrong. Sebastian checked the gauges, checked the valves, checked every component he could reach. He ran through diagnostic procedures I had seen him perform 12 times, measuring and calculating and comparing results to his carefully maintained records. Nothing had changed. Everything was exactly as it had been, and yet the machine had lost whatever stability it had found. A coincidence, he said finally, though I could hear the doubt in his voice. A momentary fluctuation. It happens sometimes. The system finds a brief equilibrium and then loses it again. I nodded, accepting the explanation because it made sense, because it was logical, because the alternative was too strange to contemplate. But it happened again the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. Every time I touched the machine, every time I rested my hands on its brass frame or leaned close to listen to its inner workings, the rhythm stabilized, and every time I stepped away, the instability returned. Sebastian began to keep records. Meticulous, obsessive records, documenting every instance of stabilization and every instance of failure. He measured my proximity to the machine. He measured the duration of my contact. He measured the ambient temperature and the electrical current and a dozen other variables I could not even name. And the results were undeniable. The machine responded to me. Not to my adjustments, not to my repairs, but to my presence. When I was close, it beat steady and strong. When I was far, it faltered and failed. "This is impossible," Sebastian said. For what must have been the 100th time. He was standing in the middle of the laboratory, surrounded by his charts and graphs, looking at me as if I were a puzzle he could not solve. There is no scientific explanation for this. No mechanism, no principle, no law of physics that can account for what we are observing. "I know," I said, because there was nothing else to say. He turned away from me, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration I had come to know well. I have spent my entire life believing in reason, in evidence, in the proposition that everything can be understood if we observe it carefully enough and think about it clearly enough. And now you come along and you make my machine work simply by existing, and I do not know what to believe anymore. I moved closer to him without thinking. I could not help it. There was something in his voice, something raw and wounded, that drew me to him like a moth to a flame. "Perhaps there are things that cannot be understood," I said gently. "Perhaps some things simply are." He turned to look at me, and we were standing very close now, close enough that I could see the flecks of blue in his gray eyes, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath on my face. His gaze dropped to my lips, then rose again to meet my eyes, and I saw something there that made my heart stammer in my chest. "Miss Ashford," he said, and his voice was rough and low. "Eleanor." It was the first time he had used my Christian name. It sounded different when he said it, softer somehow, more intimate. I swallowed hard and tried to remember all the reasons why this was a terrible idea. "Your Grace," I began, but he shook his head. "Sebastian," he said, "when we are alone, I want you to call me Sebastian." I should have refused. I should have reminded him that I was his employee, that we came from different worlds, that nothing could ever come of whatever was happening between us. But his name was on my lips before I could stop it, quiet and hesitant and full of everything I was trying not to feel. Sebastian. He closed his eyes, and something that might have been pain crossed his face. When he opened them again, he stepped back, putting distance between us, and his expression was carefully controlled. "Forgive me," he said. "That was inappropriate." "There is nothing to forgive," I said, even though my heart was racing and my hands were trembling, and I wanted nothing more than to close the distance between us again. He turned away from me, back to his charts and his graphs and his safe, logical world of measurements and data. But I saw the tension in his shoulders. I saw the way his hands gripped the edge of the workbench, and I knew, with a certainty that defied all reason, that he felt it too. Whatever this thing was between us, it was not one-sided. That night, I could not sleep. I lay in the bed that had been made up for me in one of the guest chambers, staring at the ceiling and thinking about Sebastian Vane. I knew the facts of his life now, the ones he had shared during our long hours of work together. I knew that his father had been a cold and demanding man who had seen his sons as instruments of the family legacy rather than children to be loved. I knew that his mother's death had left a void that was never filled. I knew that his younger brother, Thomas, had been the bright and golden one, the one everyone loved, the one who was supposed to inherit the title while Sebastian was left to his books and his machines. But Thomas had died. "An accident," Sebastian had said, his voice flat and empty, in my laboratory. He wanted to see what I was working on. There was an explosion. He did not survive. He had not elaborated, and I had not asked, but I saw the way his face closed whenever the subject arose. I saw the guilt that lived behind his eyes, the same guilt that drove him to work himself to exhaustion, to build machines that could save lives because he had failed to save the one life that mattered most. I understood that guilt. I carried my own version of it, a different shape but the same weight. My father had died of a fever that swept through Cheapside like a scythe, and I had been helpless to stop it. I had watched him waste away, had held his hand as he took his last breath, and I had hated myself for my powerlessness. It was that helplessness that had driven me to learn everything I could about the mechanics of the world, as if understanding how things worked could somehow protect me from ever being helpless again. But it had not, because here I was, in a duke's laboratory, watching another man die, and I was still helpless. The machine responded to my presence. Yes, but I did not know why. I could not replicate it. I could not explain it. I could not use it to save him. Unless... I sat up in bed, my mind racing. Unless the key was not in the machine at all, unless the key was in me, or rather, in whatever it was that passed between us when I stood beside him, when I touched the machine that was keeping him alive, when I let myself feel the things I was trying so hard not to feel. I thought about the heart, the real heart, the one that beat in Sebastian's chest even as it failed him. I thought about what I had said on my first night, about making the machine follow the heart instead of trying to make the heart obey the machine. I thought about the rhythm I heard when I touched the brass pipes and the copper wires, the rhythm that steadied and smoothed whenever I was near. And I thought about love, that terrifying, irrational, unscientific thing that had no place in a laboratory and yet seemed to be at the center of everything. The next morning, I found Sebastian in the laboratory as always, bent over his charts with dark circles under his eyes that suggested he had not slept either. He looked up when I entered, and something flickered across his face before he smoothed it away. "Miss Ashford," he said, and then corrected himself, his voice softening. "Eleanor, you are up early." "I could not sleep," I said. "I was thinking. About the machine? About you." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and dangerous. Sebastian stared at me, his gray eyes unreadable, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. "Eleanor," he said finally, and his voice was strained. "We cannot." "I know." I stepped closer to him, my heart pounding in my chest. "I know all the reasons. You are a duke. I am nobody. You are dying. I am supposed to save you. It is impossible. It is inappropriate. It is everything we should not want. Then why are you telling me this? Because I think it is the answer." He frowned, confusion replacing the careful control in his expression. "I do not understand." "The machine responds to me," I said. "We have established that. When I am near, your heart stabilizes. When I am far, it falters. We have data. We have evidence. But we have no explanation." "No," he agreed. "We do not. So let me propose one." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. What if the machine is not responding to my physical presence? What if it is responding to something else? Something we cannot measure or observe directly? He shook his head. "That is not science. That is mysticism." "Is it?" I moved closer still, close enough to touch him, though I kept my hands at my sides. "Your machine is connected to your heart, Sebastian. Not just mechanically. You wear the apparatus against your chest. The artificial heart beats in time with your real one. They are linked intimately and constantly. So what if your real heart is affecting the machine in ways we did not anticipate?" He was listening now, I could see it. The scientist in him was intrigued despite himself. "Go on," he said. "What if your emotions matter?" I asked. "What if the way you feel, the things you want, the fears and hopes and desires you carry, what if they influence the rhythm of your heart, and through your heart, the rhythm of the machine?" "That is," he began, and then stopped. "When you are alone," I continued, "when you are working, you are tense, anxious, frustrated. Your heart races with stress, and the machine tries to compensate, and the two of them fall out of sync. But when I am here, when we are together, something changes. You relax. You feel," I hesitated, searching for the right word, "comforted, safe, and your heart slows, and the machine follows, and everything aligns." Sebastian was very still. He was looking at me the way he had looked at his charts and graphs, analyzing, calculating, searching for the flaw in my reasoning. But I could see something else in his eyes, too, something that looked like hope. "You are suggesting," he said slowly, "that my machine works better when I feel. When you feel something positive, yes. When you feel connected to another person. When you feel—" I could not say the word. I could not bring myself to name it out loud. But he understood. Of course he did. He was brilliant, after all. "When I feel loved," he finished quietly. "Or when you love," I said. "I do not know which. Perhaps both." The silence that followed was the loudest I had ever heard. I stood there, exposed and vulnerable, waiting for him to dismiss my theory as nonsense, to remind me that he was a man of science, and I was a fool for suggesting that emotion could have any effect on a mechanical device. But he did not dismiss me. Instead, he reached out and took my hand in his fingers rough and warm against my skin. "Show me," he said. "Help me understand." So I did. I led him to the machine, to the chair where he sat during his treatments, the chair with the wires and tubes that connected him to the apparatus that kept him alive. I helped him settle into it, arranging the connections with hands that trembled only slightly. And then I stood beside him, my hand on his shoulder, and I spoke. I told him about my father, about the way he used to let me sit in his workshop and watch him work, explaining every step in a voice soft with patience and love. About the way he called me his little clockwork girl, because I was always asking questions, always wanting to understand. About the last words he ever said to me, whispered from his sickbed while the fever burned through him. "Keep listening, Eleanor. The world will tell you its secrets if you listen." I told him about my mother, fragile and fading, clinging to life with a stubbornness that broke my heart every day. About the guilt I carried for not being able to do more for her, for not being able to stop the slow decline that was stealing her away from me. I told him about my fears, that I would never be enough, that I would always be invisible, unimportant, a woman in a world that had no place for women like me, that I would die without ever knowing what it felt like to be truly seen, truly known, truly loved. And as I spoke, I watched the machine. I watched the gauges and the dials and the artificial heart beating in its glass chamber. And I saw what I had hoped to see, what I had prayed to see. The rhythm stabilized, the stutter disappeared. The beat grew strong and even and sure, and it stayed that way, minute after minute, as long as I stood beside him, as long as I kept talking, as long as I let him see the truth of who I was. When I finally fell silent, Sebastian reached up and caught my hand where it rested on his shoulder. His grip was tight, almost desperate. "I see you," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion. "Eleanor, I see you." "I know," I whispered. "I see you too." After that night, everything changed. We did not speak of love, not directly, not in words. We were both too cautious for that, too aware of all the obstacles that stood between us, too afraid of shattering the fragile thing we had built. But we stopped pretending. We stopped pretending that our touches were accidental, that our lingering looks meant nothing, that we were simply scientist and assistant, employer and employee, duke and commoner. We worked together as we always had, but now there was an intimacy to it, a warmth that had not been there before. Sebastian began to tell me about his research, not just the technical details, but the dreams behind it, the vision he had of a world where no one had to die from a failing heart, where machines could extend life and ease suffering and give people more time with the ones they loved. And I told him about my own dreams, small and practical compared to his, but dreams nonetheless. A workshop of my own, a reputation built on my own merits, a life where I answered to no one but myself. At night, we sat together in the library, surrounded by books and firelight, and we talked about everything and nothing, philosophy and poetry, and the nature of the soul, whether machines could ever truly think, whether love was a chemical reaction or something more, whether we were destined to be together or simply lucky to have found each other in the vast and random chaos of the world. I had never been happier, and I had never been more afraid, because Sebastian was still dying. The machine worked better now, with me beside him, but it was not a cure. It was a reprieve, a delay of the inevitable. Every day I saw the signs of his deterioration, the tremor in his hands, the pallor that crept over his skin, the moments when he would stop mid-sentence, his breath catching, his hand pressed to his chest, waiting for the pain to pass. We did not talk about it. We did not have to. We both knew the truth. Whatever time we had together, it was borrowed time, stolen time, and eventually it would run out. It was in the third week of my stay at Raven's home that the other trouble began. I had known, in an abstract way, that Sebastian's work was controversial. The idea of a machine that could sustain a human heart was radical enough to invite skepticism from the scientific establishment and condemnation from the religious authorities. The church had already denounced the work as an abomination, a mortal sin against the natural order established by God. There had been sermons preached against it, pamphlets distributed, warnings issued from pulpits across England about the dangers of men who sought to play at being the creator. But I had not understood how dangerous that controversy could be until the morning a man named Dr. Marcus Hartwell arrived at the manor. The day had begun like any other. Sebastian and I had been working in the laboratory since dawn, making adjustments to the pressure regulation system based on data we had collected the previous night. The machine was running more smoothly now, responding to my presence with an eagerness that still unsettled me, and we were beginning to hope that we might find a way to make the improvement permanent. It was Hughes who interrupted us, appearing at the door to the laboratory with an expression of barely concealed alarm on his weathered face. "Your Grace," he said, and his voice was tight with something that might have been fear. "There is a gentleman here to see you. He says he is an old friend." Sebastian looked up from the gauge he had been adjusting, his brow furrowing. "I told you I am not receiving visitors. I explained that to him, Your Grace, but he was most insistent. He says his name is Dr. Marcus Hartwell." The change that came over Sebastian was immediate and profound. His face went pale, then flushed with color. His hands, which had been steady on the brass fitting, began to tremble, and in his gray eyes, I saw something I had never seen before: fear. "Where is he?" Sebastian asked, and his voice was very quiet. "In the drawing room, Your Grace." Sebastian stood very still for a moment, and I could see him gathering himself, armoring himself against whatever was about to come. Then he turned to me, and his expression was carefully blank. "Stay here," he said. "Do not come up until I send for you." "Sebastian," I began, But he shook his head. "Please, Eleanor. This is not something I want you involved in." He left before I could argue, his footsteps echoing on the stone stairs. I stood alone in the laboratory, surrounded by the hum of machines and the steady beat of the artificial heart, and I tried to convince myself that everything would be all right. I failed. Perhaps half an hour passed, perhaps longer. I tried to work, to distract myself with calibrations and measurements, but I could not focus. The machine sensed my agitation, its rhythm becoming less steady, less smooth, as if my worry was infecting it through some invisible connection. And then I heard voices, raised voices, coming from somewhere above. Sebastian's voice, sharp with anger, and another voice, smooth and cold and cultured, that sent a chill down my spine, even though I had never heard it before. I did not stay in the laboratory as Sebastian had asked. I could not. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and I had to know what it was. I climbed the stairs as quietly as I could, my soft-soled shoes making no sound on the worn stone. The voices grew louder as I approached the drawing room, and I pressed myself against the wall beside the door, listening. "You cannot keep this secret forever, Sebastian." The smooth voice, "Hartwell, be reasonable. The work you have done here has implications far beyond your own survival. It belongs to the world. It belongs to me." Sebastian's voice, tight with barely contained fury. "I built it. I have bled for it. I will decide what happens to it." "And what will happen to it, old friend? Will you take it to your grave? Because that is where you are headed, whether you like it or not. Your machine is failing. Everyone knows it. The question is not whether you will die, but what will become of your research when you do." There was a pause, heavy with tension, and then Sebastian spoke again, and his voice was like ice. "How do you know my machine is failing?" "I have my sources." Hartwell's tone was light, almost amused. "You cannot expect to employ servants and maintain complete secrecy. People talk, Sebastian. They talk about the strange sounds from the cellar, about the woman who arrived and never left, about the Duke who never sleeps and rarely eats and seems more machine than man. They talk, and I listen." My heart clenched at the mention of myself. He knew about me. This Hartwell, whoever he was, knew that I was here. I pushed the door open and stepped into the room. Both men turned to look at me. Sebastian's face went even paler, if that were possible, and I saw fear flash in his eyes. Not fear of Hartwell, I realized, but fear for me. "Eleanor, I told you to stay downstairs." I smiled at him, trying to project a calm I did not feel. I thought I might be able to help. Hartwell studied me with eyes that were pale blue and cold as winter ice. He was silver-haired and elegantly dressed in an expensive coat that probably cost more than I earned in a year. His face was handsome in a sharp, predatory way, with high cheekbones and a thin mouth that smiled without warmth. He looked like a man who had never been denied anything he wanted and who had no intention of starting now. He came without invitation, without warning, a silver-haired gentleman in an expensive coat who introduced himself as a colleague of Sebastian's from his university days. But there was nothing collegial about the way he looked at the laboratory, at the machine, at me. His eyes were cold and calculating, and when he smiled, it did not reach them. "Remarkable," he said, circling the cardiomechanical sustainer like a predator sizing up its prey. "Absolutely remarkable. I had heard rumors, of course, but I never imagined you had come so far." Sebastian stood stiffly beside me, his posture rigid with a tension I had never seen in him before. "How did you find me, Marcus?" I made it clear I wished to be left alone. Hartwell laughed, a thin and unpleasant sound. "Come now, Sebastian. You cannot expect to revolutionize medicine and remain a recluse forever. The Royal Society has been asking questions. The newspapers have been sniffing around. It was only a matter of time before someone came to see for himself." "Someone," Sebastian repeated flatly. "Or you specifically?" The smile on Hartwell's face hardened. "I am here as a friend, Sebastian. I want to help you. Think about what this could mean, not just for you, but for science, for humanity. With proper funding, proper support, we could refine this technology, mass produce it, save thousands of lives. And who would control this production?" Sebastian asked. "You?" "A partnership," Hartwell said smoothly. "Equal partners, working together for the common good. I watched this exchange with growing unease. There was something wrong here, something I could not quite put my finger on. The way Hartwell looked at the machine was not the look of a scientist admiring a colleague's work. It was the look of a man calculating what something was worth and how he could take it. "I do not need partners," Sebastian said. "I do not need funding. What I need is to be left alone to continue my research in peace." Hartwell's expression shifted, the pleasant mask slipping to reveal something colder beneath. "Peace is a luxury you cannot afford, old friend. Not anymore. Word of your machine is spreading. There are people, powerful people, who are very interested in what you have built here. Some of them want to see it developed for the good of mankind. Others," his eyes flickered to me, then back to Sebastian, "others want to see it developed for other purposes." "What purposes?" "Military applications," Hartwell said simply. "Imagine soldiers who cannot be killed by a shot to the heart. Imagine an army of men with machines in their chests, fighting without fear of death. There are generals who would pay a fortune for such a thing. And if you refuse to provide it, they will find a way to take it." The blood drained from Sebastian's face. "You cannot be serious." "I am entirely serious." Hartwell stepped closer, lowering his voice as if sharing a confidence. "I am trying to protect you, Sebastian. If you partner with me, if you let me handle the business side of things, I can keep the vultures at bay. But if you insist on playing the hermit, if you refuse to engage with the world, you will be devoured." He paused, his gaze sliding to me again. "Along with anyone foolish enough to stand beside you." The threat was clear, not just to Sebastian, but to me as well. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach, fear mingled with anger, and I stepped forward before I could stop myself. "I think you should leave," I said, and my voice was steadier than I expected. Hartwell raised an eyebrow. "And who are you to tell me anything, girl?" "She is my colleague," Sebastian said, and there was steel in his voice now. "And she is right. You are not welcome here, Marcus. Not anymore." For a long moment, Hartwell stared at us both, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed and shook his head, as if disappointed by a wayward child. "Very well," he said. "I will go. But think about what I have said, Sebastian. Think about what is at stake. This is not a decision you can avoid forever." He left without another word, his footsteps echoing through the empty halls of the manor. When the front door finally closed behind him, Sebastian sagged against the workbench, his face gray with exhaustion and something that might have been fear. "He will be back," he said quietly. "Or someone like him. They will not stop until they have what they want." "What do we do?" I asked. He looked at me, and in his eyes I saw the weight of all his years of isolation, all his failed hopes, all his carefully buried dreams. "I do not know," he admitted. "I have spent so long trying to save myself that I never considered what would happen if I succeeded. If this machine works, if it can truly keep a heart beating indefinitely, it will change everything. Medicine, war, the very nature of life and death. And I am not sure the world is ready for that change. Then we make sure it falls into the right hands," I said. "We protect it. We protect you." He smiled at that, a small and weary smile that broke my heart. "You make it sound so simple." "Nothing about this is simple." I reached out and took his hand, threading my fingers through his. "But I did not come here to let you die, Sebastian Vane, and I am not going to let anyone take this machine, or you, without a fight." The weeks that followed were tense and strange, filled with a constant sense of being watched. Sebastian increased the security around the estate, hiring additional staff to patrol the grounds and installing new locks on all the doors. We moved the most critical components of the machine to a hidden chamber beneath the laboratory, accessible only through a series of passages that Sebastian had discovered as a child. But even as we prepared for the worst, we also continued to work. The data I had gathered about the machine's response to my presence had given Sebastian a new direction for his research. If emotion could affect the rhythm of the heart, and through the heart, the rhythm of the machine, then perhaps there was a way to stabilize the system permanently, a way to make the connection independent of my physical proximity. He threw himself into this work with a desperate intensity that worried me. He slept only when his body forced him to, ate only when I reminded him, pushed himself far beyond what was safe or healthy. and I watched helplessly, knowing that every day brought him closer to the breakthrough he sought, and also closer to the end. It was during one of these long nights of work that the truth finally came out about his brother. We were sitting in the laboratory, surrounded by diagrams and half-built prototypes, when Sebastian suddenly stopped what he was doing and stared at nothing. "I killed him," he said, and his voice was flat and empty, drained of all emotion. "Thomas, my brother, I killed him." I did not speak. I did not move. I simply waited, giving him the space to say what he needed to say. "He was 17, Sebastian continued, bright and curious and full of life, everything I was not. My father adored him. Everyone adored him. And I was jealous. Not of the attention, not of the love, but of the ease with which he moved through the world. He never doubted himself, never questioned whether he belonged. He simply was, and everyone accepted him." He fell silent for a moment, and I saw his hands trembling where they rested on the workbench. He wanted to see my laboratory. I had been working on an early version of the cardiomechanical sustainer, a crude prototype that used compressed steam to power an artificial pump. I warned him it was dangerous. I told him to stay back, but he did not listen. He never listened. Sebastian closed his eyes. The boiler exploded. I do not know why. A fault in the pressure valve, perhaps, or a weakness in the casing. It does not matter. The result was the same. Thomas was standing too close. The blast killed him instantly. I reached out and covered his hands with mine. "I am sorry," I said, because there was nothing else to say. He opened his eyes and looked at me, and I saw tears there, tears he had probably never let himself shed before. "I built this machine to atone," he said. "Not just to save my own life, but to prove that something good could come from his death, that the technology that killed him could someday save others. But I have been so focused on the mechanics of it, the science, that I forgot the most important part." "What part?" "The part that makes us human." He turned his hands over, interlacing his fingers with mine. "I forgot that the heart is more than a pump. It is the seat of everything we are. Our hopes, our fears, our capacity to love and be loved. And you, Eleanor, you reminded me of that. You reminded me that some things cannot be measured or calibrated or controlled. Some things simply are, and we must accept them." I felt tears prickling at my own eyes. "Sebastian," I whispered. "I love you," he said, and his voice was steady now, clear and certain. "I love you, and I do not care that it is inappropriate or impossible or doomed. I love you, and whatever time I have left, I want to spend it with you, if you will have me." For a long moment, I could not speak. My heart was too full, too overwhelmed with emotions I had never allowed myself to feel. But then I lifted his hands to my lips and kissed them, tasting salt and metal and the faint bitterness of the chemicals he worked with. "I will have you," I said. "For as long as we have, I will have you." That night, we did not work. We sat together in the library, wrapped in each other's arms, and we made plans for a future we both knew might never come. Sebastian spoke of taking me to Paris, to Vienna, to all the great cities of Europe where science and art flourished side by side. He spoke of teaching me everything he knew, of helping me establish my own reputation in the world of engineering and invention. He spoke of marriage quietly and hesitantly, as if afraid I might refuse. I did not refuse. I accepted, with tears in my eyes and joy in my heart, knowing that I might be making a promise I could not keep, that death might steal him from me before any vows could be exchanged. But I did not care. In that moment, surrounded by firelight and shadows and the quiet ticking of the clock on the mantel, I was happier than I had ever been, and I chose to believe that it would last, that we would find a way, that love would be enough. It was not enough. 3 days later, Marcus Hartwell returned, and he did not come alone. They arrived at midnight, a dozen men in dark coats carrying weapons I did not recognize, strange devices that hummed with electrical current and threw off sparks of blue light. The night was moonless and cold, a thin autumn mist creeping across the grounds of Ravensholm like ghostly fingers reaching for the manor walls. I had been sleeping fitfully, plagued by dreams I could not remember, but that left me sweating and afraid. It was the sound that woke me, a muffled cry cut short, followed by the heavy thump of something falling. The guard outside my door. The man Sebastian had posted there to keep me safe. Before I could react, before I could even fully understand what was happening, my bedroom door burst open and men poured through. They were dressed in black, their faces obscured by scarves and low-pulled hats, and they moved with the silent efficiency of trained soldiers. I tried to scream, but a hand clamped over my mouth, rough leather smelling of oil and gunpowder. I tried to fight, kicking and clawing, but there were too many of them, and they were too strong. They bound my hands behind my back with rope that bit into my wrists. They gagged me with a cloth that tasted of dust and fear. And then they dragged me from my bed and down the corridor, past other bodies lying still and silent, past portraits that watched with painted eyes that seemed to weep. They overwhelmed the guards Sebastian had hired without a sound, moving through the manor like shadows, silent and deadly and utterly without mercy. Every servant who crossed their path was struck down. Every locked door was forced open. Every obstacle was removed with cold, mechanical precision. They took me to the laboratory, half carrying, half dragging me down the stairs I had descended so many times before. The door was already open, the lock shattered, and from within I could hear the steady thump of the cardiomechanical sustainer, still beating, still fighting to keep Sebastian alive. When they pushed me through the door, I saw him immediately. Sebastian was already there, held between two of Hartwell's men, his arms twisted behind his back, a gun pressed to his temple. His face was pale and his hands were trembling, but his eyes were filled with a cold fury I had never seen before. He looked at me, and I saw the anguish in those storm-gray depths, the fear, not for himself, I realized, for me. "Eleanor," he breathed, and his voice cracked on my name. Hartwell stood in the center of the room, his silver hair gleaming in the gaslight, his expression one of smug satisfaction. He had removed his expensive coat and rolled up his sleeves, as if preparing for dirty work, and there was something almost eager in the way he surveyed the laboratory, the machines, the artificial heart still beating in its glass chamber. "I did warn you," he said. "I told you this was coming. You should have listened. What do you want?" Sebastian's voice was steady, despite the gun at his head. "The machine? Take it. Take all of it. Just let her go." Hartwell laughed. "Oh, I intend to take the machine. But I need more than metal and glass, Sebastian. I need the knowledge to make it work. I need the years of research that exist only in your head. And I have been told," his eyes slid to me, "that there is something special about this woman. Something that makes the machine function better than it ever has before." I felt a chill run down my spine. How could he know that? We had been so careful, so secretive. The only people who knew about my connection to the machine were Sebastian and myself. And then I understood. The servants. One of them must have been reporting to Hartwell all along, watching us, listening, passing along everything they heard. Sebastian understood too. I saw it in his face, the realization, the betrayal, the anger. "She has nothing to do with this," he said. "She is just an assistant. Whatever you have heard, it is exaggerated. I do not think so." Hartwell stepped closer to me, close enough that I could smell the pomade in his hair and the tobacco on his breath. "My sources tell me that the machine stabilizes in her presence, that her touch, her voice, her mere proximity somehow affects its function. Is that not fascinating? A machine that responds to emotion, to love." He smiled, and it was the smile of a man who had already won. Imagine the possibilities. An army of soldiers bound not by duty or discipline, but by love, by devotion. Each one carrying a machine in his chest that beats only for the woman he adores. Unquestioning loyalty, unfailing obedience, the perfect weapon. "You are insane," I said, and my voice was shaking with fear and rage. "That is not how it works. That is not what we built. Perhaps not, but it is what I will make of it." He turned back to Sebastian. "You have a choice, old friend. Help me willingly, share your knowledge, perfect the technology, and I will let her live. Refuse, and, well." He gestured to one of his men, who pulled a knife from his belt and pressed it to my throat. I am sure you can imagine. Sebastian looked at me, and I saw the anguish in his eyes, the impossible choice laid out before him, his life's work, perverted into a weapon of war, or my life, forfeit. I shook my head, trying to tell him not to do it, not to give in, but he was not looking at me anymore. He was looking at the machine, at the cardio-mechanical sustainer that had kept him alive for 3 years, at the artificial heart beating steadily in its glass chamber. And then he did something I did not expect. He smiled. "You want to know how the machine works?" he said, and his voice was calm now, almost serene. "Very well, I will show you." He pulled free of the men holding him so suddenly that they did not have time to react. Before anyone could move, he was at the main control panel, his hands flying over the switches and dials. "Sebastian, no," I screamed, because I understood what he was about to do. "I love you," he said, and he looked at me with those gray eyes one last time. "Remember that." He pulled the lever. The machine exploded, not in fire, not in flame, but in a burst of electrical energy that arced through the laboratory like the wrath of an angry god. Blue-white lightning leaped from terminal to terminal, from wire to wire, from node to node, building in intensity until the entire room seemed to pulse with power. The air itself seemed to burn, charged with so much electricity that I could feel my hair rising from my scalp, could taste copper on my tongue, could smell the sharp scent of ozone mixing with the acrid smoke of burning rubber. The lightning struck Hartwell first, catching him where he stood in the center of the room, lifting him off his feet and throwing him backward against the wall. His body convulsed once, twice, and then was still. His men suffered the same fate, one by one, their weapons clattering to the floor, their screams cut short as the electrical surge found them and claimed them. I felt the charge pass over me, through me, a wave of heat and light that seemed to pierce my very soul. For a moment, I thought I was dying. For a moment, I saw nothing but blinding whiteness, heard nothing but a roar like the sound of all the thunderstorms in the world compressed into a single instant. And then the whiteness faded, and the roar became silence, and I found myself lying on the floor of the laboratory, gasping for breath, my ears ringing, my vision swimming with after-images of blue fire. When I could see again, when I could think again, I found myself surrounded by chaos. Hartwell's men were scattered across the floor, some of them moving weakly, groaning and clutching at burns that covered their skin, others utterly still, their eyes open and staring at nothing. The electrical equipment that had lined the walls was destroyed, reduced to smoking ruins of melted wire and shattered glass. The diagrams that had papered every surface were burning, their edges curling and blackening as flames consumed Sebastian's lifework. And the machine, the cardio-mechanical sustainer that had been Sebastian's masterpiece, his obsession, his only hope for survival. It was a ruin, a twisted mass of metal and glass that no longer hummed, no longer crackled, no longer beat with the artificial pulse that had kept him alive for 3 years. The heart in the glass chamber was dark, silent, dead, and Sebastian. Sebastian was lying at the base of the control panel, his hand still on the lever, his body crumpled like a marionette whose strings had been cut. His eyes were closed. His chest was not moving. His skin, in the flickering light of the fires, was the color of old wax. I crawled to him. I do not know how. My body was numb, every muscle screaming in protest, my mind refusing to accept what my eyes were showing me. But I crawled, hand over hand, knee over knee, until I reached his side and could gather him in my arms. His head fell against my breast, heavy and still. His hand, when I took it in mine, was cool to the touch, and when I pressed my ear to his chest, searching desperately for the heartbeat that had been my companion through all those weeks of work and wonder and impossible hope, I heard nothing, nothing but silence. "No," I whispered. The word came out broken, cracked, barely human. "No, no, no. You cannot leave me. You promised we would have more time." But he did not answer. He could not answer. The machine that had kept his heart beating was destroyed, and with it, any hope of saving him, any hope of the future we had dreamed of, any hope of anything at all. I held him there, in the ruins of his laboratory, surrounded by the wreckage of his dreams, and the bodies of his enemies. I held him, and I wept. I wept for the man I loved, for the life we would never share, for all the words left unspoken and all the touches left unfelt. I wept for the children we would never have, for the mornings we would never wake to together, for the simple joys of companionship that had been stolen from us before they could even begin. I wept until there were no tears left, until my eyes were raw and my throat was ragged and my heart felt like a stone in my chest, until the dawn light began to creep through the shattered windows, pale and gray and utterly without warmth, until I heard the sounds of servants arriving, summoned by the explosion and the fire, their voices raised in shock and fear as they discovered the devastation below. And then, through my grief, through the numbing fog of loss that had settled over me like a shroud, I heard something else, a sound, soft and rhythmic, coming from somewhere beneath me, coming from somewhere inside the man I held in my arms. I went very still. I was afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid that the slightest disturbance would make the sound disappear, would reveal it to be nothing more than a cruel trick of my grieving mind. But the sound continued, faint but unmistakable, a beat, a pulse, a rhythm I knew better than I knew my own name. I looked down at Sebastian's chest, at the place where the apparatus had been connected, and I saw that it was moving, rising and falling, slowly, weakly, but unmistakably. His heart was beating, not the machine. His heart, his real heart, the one that had been failing for years, the one that the machine had been designed to replace. It was beating on its own. "Sebastian!" I gasped, and I pressed my hand to his chest, feeling the pulse beneath my palm. "Sebastian, can you hear me?" His eyes fluttered, opened, focused on my face with an expression of bewildered wonder. "Eleanor?" His voice was a whisper, barely audible. "What happened? I feel different." "The machine," I said, and I was crying again, but these were different tears, tears of joy, tears of impossible hope. "The machine is gone, but you are alive. Your heart, Sebastian. Your heart is beating." He raised his hand, touching his own chest as if he could not believe it. "But how?" "The machine was the only thing keeping me alive. Without it, I should be dead." "I do not know," I admitted, "but I intend to find out." The weeks that followed were a blur of doctors and examinations and tests that none of us could explain. Sebastian's heart, which had been failing for years, which had been deteriorating steadily despite the machine's support, was now somehow stronger than it had been in a decade. Not perfect, not fully healed, but functional, stable, capable of keeping him alive without mechanical assistance. The doctors called it a miracle. Sebastian called it impossible. But I had another theory. The machine had been designed to support the heart, to take over its functions when it could no longer perform them on its own. But Sebastian had never intended for it to heal the heart. He had assumed that the damage was permanent, irreversible, and that the best he could hope for was to delay the inevitable. But the machine had been connected to him for 3 years. 3 years of electrical impulses and regulated rhythms. 3 years of perfect synchronization between the mechanical heart and the organic one. And in that time, something had happened. The organic heart had learned from the mechanical one. It had adapted. It had healed itself, slowly and imperceptibly, guided by the steady rhythm of the machine. Or perhaps it was something else entirely. Perhaps it was the love that had flowed between us, the connection that had stabilized the machine in ways we could not explain. Perhaps, in the end, the heart that saved Sebastian was not the one made of metal and rubber, but the one that beat in my chest, reaching out to his across the space between us. I will never know for certain. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved. Some miracles are not meant to be explained. What I do know is this. Marcus Hartwell was arrested and charged with conspiracy and attempted murder. The men he had brought to Ravensholm were identified as mercenaries in the employ of foreign powers, and the scandal that followed brought down several high-ranking officials who had been involved in the scheme. Sebastian's machine was destroyed, but the knowledge he had accumulated was not. He spent the following months writing down everything he knew, documenting his research in meticulous detail, so that others could build on his work in the future. Not for war, not for profit, but for healing, for the relief of suffering, for the chance to give others the miracle that had been given to him. And as for us, for Sebastian and Eleanor, for the Duke and the clockmaker's daughter, we were married in the spring, in the small chapel on the Ravensholm estate, with only the servants and a few close friends as witnesses. It was not a grand wedding. It was not a society affair, but it was ours, and that was all that mattered. My mother lived to see me married. She sat in the front pew, frail but smiling, and when Sebastian slipped the ring onto my finger, I saw tears streaming down her cheeks. She died that summer, peacefully, in her sleep, and I mourned her with a grief that was tinged with gratitude. Gratitude that she had seen me happy. Gratitude that she had known, before the end, that her daughter was loved. Sebastian lived for many years after that. His heart, the one that had once been failing, grew stronger with each passing season. We had children, 2 daughters and a son, and he lived to see them grow, to teach them about machines and medicine and the strange alchemy of love. But I am getting ahead of myself. This story, the story of how I came to Ravensholm and found more than I ever expected, ends not with a wedding or a birth or a death, but with a moment, a single, perfect moment that I carry with me still, decades later, when my own hair has turned silver and my own heart beats a little slower than it used to. It was the morning after the explosion, after I had realized that Sebastian was alive, after the doctors had come and gone and left us both exhausted and bewildered. We were sitting in the library, the same library where we had spent so many nights talking about science and philosophy and the nature of love. The fire had burned down to embers, and the morning light was streaming through the windows, and Sebastian was holding my hand. "I do not understand," he said, for what must have been the 100th time. "I should be dead." "Yes," I agreed. "You should be." "Then why am I not?" I thought about the question for a long moment. I thought about the machine and its rhythms, about the heart and its mysteries, about all the things we had discovered and all the things we never would. "Because," I said finally, "some things are stronger than machines, stronger than science, stronger than death itself." He looked at me, and I saw the skepticism in his eyes, the man of logic struggling against the evidence of his own existence. "What things?" he asked. "You know what things." He did know. He had always known, even when he was trying so hard not to believe it. "Love," he said softly. "You mean love?" "I mean love," I confirmed, and I leaned over and kissed him. There in the morning light, with the taste of hope on my lips. "The machine is gone," Sebastian said when we finally pulled apart. "Everything I worked for, everything I built, gone." "Yes," I said, "but you are still here, and so am I, and that is all that matters." He was silent for a long moment, thinking. Then he smiled, a real smile, one that reached his eyes and transformed his whole face. "I suppose," he said slowly, "that I will have to build something new. We can build it together." "Together," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "Yes, I think I would like that." And so we did. We built a life together, a life full of work and wonder, of challenges and triumphs, of joy and sorrow and everything in between. We built machines that healed and devices that helped, and we shared our knowledge freely with anyone who wanted to learn. Sebastian published his research, all of it, in a series of papers that shocked the scientific establishment and changed the course of medical history. He held nothing back. The principles of the cardiomechanical sustainer, the techniques he had developed, the discoveries he had made about the connection between emotion and physiology, all of it was laid bare for the world to see and study and improve upon. Some called him a hero, others called him a madman. The church continued to condemn his work, and there were those who whispered that he had made a deal with the devil, that no man could cheat death without paying a terrible price. But Sebastian did not care about the whispers. He cared only about the lives that might be saved, the suffering that might be eased, the hope that might be given to others who faced the same fate he had once faced. And the work continued, not just for Sebastian, but for others who came after him. Young scientists and engineers who read his papers and saw the possibilities, who built on his foundations and pushed the boundaries even further. The machines grew smaller, more refined, more reliable. The techniques improved, and slowly, Year by year, the idea that a failing heart could be supported, could be sustained, could be given more time, became not a miracle, but a medical reality. Sebastian lived to see the first successful implantation of a fully autonomous cardiac support device in 1907, 24 years after the night he had destroyed his machine to save me from Hartwell's men. He wept when he heard the news, tears of joy streaming down his face as he held my hand in his heart, his real heart, beating steady and strong in his chest. "We did it," he whispered. "Eleanor, we did it. We built something else, too, something even more important than machines or medical advances. We built a family, 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, each of them as brilliant and as stubborn and as full of wonder as their father. They grew up in Ravensholm Manor, running through halls that no longer echoed with emptiness, playing in gardens that bloomed again with flowers and life. Our eldest daughter, Catherine, inherited her father's mind for mechanics and her mother's ear for the voices of machines. She became the first woman admitted to the Royal Society of Engineers, and her work on precision instrumentation changed the way the world measured time. Our son, Thomas, named for the uncle he never knew, became a physician who specialized in diseases of the heart, carrying on his father's legacy in his own way. And our youngest, little Anna, with her wild red hair and her endless questions, became a writer who told stories of love and loss and impossible miracles, and who always said that her favorite story was ours. But more than that, we built a love. A love that started in a dark laboratory, surrounded by the hum of impossible machines. A love that grew through arguments and discoveries and long nights of work. A love that survived betrayal and violence and the very real possibility of death. A love that proved to be stronger than any machine, more enduring than any metal, more powerful than any force in all the universe. I am old now. My hands are no longer steady enough to work with gears and wires. My eyes are no longer sharp enough to read the fine print on diagrams. The woman who once could hear the soul of a machine is now deaf in one ear and cannot always remember what she had for breakfast. But when I close my eyes and listen, truly listen, the way my father taught me so many years ago, I can still hear it, the rhythm, the beat, the steady, eternal pulse of a heart that refuses to stop. Sebastian's heart, my heart, our hearts, beating together as they have for all these years. Sebastian passed last winter, peacefully in his sleep, with my hand in his and a smile on his lips. He was 87 years old, more than half a century past the 2 years his doctors had given him when his heart first began to fail. The machine in the basement had been destroyed for decades, but his heart had never stopped beating. Not until the very end. I miss him. I miss him every day, every hour, every moment. I miss the sound of his voice and the touch of his hand and the way he would look at me sometimes with those storm-gray eyes, as if I were the most wondrous thing he had ever seen. I miss arguing with him about calibrations and tolerances. I miss the way he brought me tea without being asked. I miss everything about him, and I know I will go on missing him until my own heart finally stops. But I do not grieve. Not really. Because I know, with a certainty that defies all logic and all reason, that our love did not end when his heart stopped beating. It did not end when they lowered his body into the ground beside the small chapel on the Ravensholm estate, where our children and grandchildren gathered to say goodbye. It did not end when the minister spoke words of dust and ashes and the promise of resurrection. Our love endures. It echoes through the generations, carried in the hearts of our children and their children and all the children who will come after. It lives in the machines that heal and the devices that save and the medical miracles that have become commonplace in this new century. It pulses in the darkness, a rhythm in the silence, a beat that will go on long after I am gone, long after we are both nothing but memory and dust, because that is what love is, not a feeling, not an emotion. Not a chemical reaction or an electrical impulse or anything that can be measured or calibrated or controlled. It is a force, a power, the most powerful force in all the universe, stronger than science, stronger than death, stronger than time itself. And I, Eleanor Ashford Vane, former clockmaker's daughter, wife of a duke, mother of 3, and lifelong believer in impossible things, I was lucky enough to know it. I never believed in miracles until I heard one ticking inside a dying man's chest. But now I know the truth. The miracle was not the machine. The miracle was us,